So, delighted to welcome so many people here for what I'm sure is going to be a really interesting session. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Deborah Terry and I have the privilege of being Vice-Chancellor of Curtin University in Western Australia, certainly a young university, an energetic university and part of the Australian Technology network of universities. Can I obviously acknowledge Times Higher Ed and thank them for all of their work hosting this really good summit, and obviously QUT as well as our host. It's been wonderfully organised. So before I start, can I too acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects and my thanks to their elders, past, present and future. And as we've heard, they've been custodians of our wonderful land on which our universities exist here in Australia for many tens of thousands of years, and we thank them and we acknowledge them. Very fortunate today to have with us an excellent panel of speakers who I will introduce in turn presently. But they're all very well positioned to talk about a topic that I know is certainly dear to our hearts here in this room, and that is new models for university business collaboration. From my perspective, looking at new models for how we work together to contribute to a robust innovation ecosystem is exactly where we should be focused. I think if we look back to what's been achieved here in Australia since the welcome launch in late 2015 of Australia's National Innovation and Science Agenda, you could argue that we've been focused too much on articulating and analysing the problems and not enough on looking to the future. We all recognise, and we've heard that this morning, that our economies are transforming and future growth and prosperity will be underpinned by innovation, and it will be underpinned by new knowledge-based industries. In Australia, we also recognise that we punch above our weight in terms of research capability and output. Relatively small nation, but we generate close to 4% of the world's scientific output. But where we fall down is in our capacity to translate this research into commercial outcomes and into economic growth. Much of the responsibility for this well-documented problem has been attributed to the lack of stronger university-industry collaborations. Over the past year or so here in Australia, we've spent a lot of time trawling the data and reflecting on the reasons that might have led to this situation. We are making changes to some of our grant schemes, changes to some of our funding mechanisms for universities, new IP arrangements, a new research assessment exercise. These will all help to address the problem, but my view is we need to go much further. We need to understand what works and why in order to articulate and embed new models for university business collaboration. And I'm just going to take one example from my own institution. We're host of one of the global Cisco Innovation Centres. It's in collaboration with Woodside, and we're exploring new fail-fast ways of working with industry to deliver innovative digital solutions. So unlike the past, we're now working with many, many more industry partners on a day-to-day basis, but quite quickly we're saying we've either solved that problem for you or we haven't, and we move on to work with another group. And that sits alongside, obviously, our deep industry partnerships that we've had for many years. So what we want to do today is to discuss this topic, what's working well, what do we need to do differently. We've got, as I say, a great panel here, and what I'm going to do is to call up each of our speakers in turn. We've been downstairs already having a really good discussion. We should have televised it. We answered lots of good questions and had good debate. But I'm going to ask each of our speakers to come up and say a few words for opening statements, and then obviously we're going to have a panel discussion, and then we're going to open up the session for lots of Q&A, I would hope. Now, our first panellist is Professor Brian MacCraith. Brian was appointed President of Dublin City University, DCU, in July 2010, a position that he will hold for 10 years. He holds a personal chair in physics at DCU and is internationally renowned for his research on optical chemical sensors, nanobiotechnology and biosensors. He was the founding director of both the National Centre for Sensor Research and the Biomedical Diagnostics Institute at DCU. He's an elected member of the Royal Irish Academy and a fellow of the Institute of Physics. He has a strong commitment to student entrepreneurship and recently chaired the National Review of STEM Education for the Irish government. So please join me in welcoming Brian.
Thanks very much, Deborah, for the kind introduction. Can I explain first that Ireland is staying in Europe, right? So Brexit creates many opportunities for us, and we hope, and you heard my colleague Paddy from across the border earlier on, we hope that we can find ways in the negotiations that the stability of all of the island of Ireland and the mobility of staff and students will be preserved in all negotiations, so that the challenges Paddy is facing can be more advantageously worked out. Just a backdrop. I think it's important to state from a context perspective, first of all, that one of the great fundamental changes in higher education globally in recent years, especially for publicly funded universities, that they all have moved from being essentially perceived by governments as a public good and let do their own thing, to becoming really strong instruments of government policy, and particularly in the context of economic development and bringing us into the areas of innovation, entrepreneurship, foreign direct investment, and so on. So the issue of university business collaborations becomes very central, I think, to universities worldwide. To say for my university, Dublin City University, it's not a new thing for us. We are a young university, but from our very inception, we were established to be a business-friendly university. And when I took over in 2010, I introduced the strapline University of Enterprise, and it makes it very clear. Two things. One is we engage very proactively with enterprise, and we focus on developing enterprising and innovative mindsets in our students and our graduates. A very strong focus on employability, and one of the manifestations of that is internships. A lot of our degrees would be industry informed, and I think that's particularly important. I'll come back to that point. All of our major research centres are deep industry academic partnerships, and you heard some examples earlier on that, but it means industry partners from around the world place their researchers in laboratories on our campus. One of our recent developments 2 years ago, and I looked at what the model of what was happening in Taiwan, some very interesting models there, created a technology park, and now we have close to 50 companies 5 minutes walk from our main academic campus, but that creates a really interesting engagement with high-tech companies nearby, and I think that's critically important. We have a number of not just collaborations, but deep strategic, multifaceted partnerships. We just signed one with Intel, we'll sign another one with IBM shortly, and that brings us into a new sort of relationship where it's not fixed around a single project, but it's across a range of areas, and it can evolve over time, but it's a very public statement of close collaboration. And finally, and I think it's very important in terms of what we're talking about, effective translation of knowledge created in universities into industry. We've just been just established Ireland's first Fraunhofer Centre, linked into the Institute for Production Technologies in Aachen. Now, there's very few of those around the world. I think there's only one in the UK, and that's in University of Strathclyde. There's a number in the US. I think there's one, Martin, in the Netherlands. I think it's in the University of Twente. But that's a model of translation, a model of operating at high TRLs, technology readiness levels. But it's really, from a government perspective in Ireland, a way of looking at how we can more efficiently translate investment in research into economic development. So that just gives you a profile of our university in terms of why I'm here, I suppose, and why I have particular views on what works. My own research background was all in industry academic partnerships. So I'm going to mention two issues in my 5 minutes in terms of what I think what's central to effective UBC's university business collaborations. First of all, it's around the nature of graduates. And the language being used in the US at the moment to describe this is T-shaped. That is, it's a combination of the downward stroke of the T being the deep disciplinary knowledge, and that's not being compromised or diluted, but combined with broader attributes in the student and graduate in terms of transferable skills, ability to work across boundaries, ability to be adaptable, and so on. That's one point. Secondly, in terms of industry engagement, we know that what's of particular importance to them is the relevance of curricular content. And the way we're dealing with that is, well, there's a number of approaches. One is we have an industry advisory board for many of our degree programs. We've just recently introduced the concept of a living degree, because for some technology areas, and data analytics, Internet of Things would be good examples, they're changing so quickly that it's difficult for curriculum to keep up. So we now have created open pods in particularly the latter half of four-year degrees, where industries come in and give effectively master classes on those topics. So you get domain-specific knowledge on a regular basis, so it keeps the content of the degree and therefore the relevance and the expertise knowledge of the students and graduates up to date. We've done that in a data science degree, and I'll mention that in a second. There's another interesting point here, and I think we'll hear more about this from Carla from Northeastern University later on, and that is industry partners are telling us they really like a lot of the attributes and critical thinking skills, communication skills of humanities graduates, but that there's, for many of the knowledge-based industries, there's a deficit. So the whole issue of bringing at a very minimum digital literacy, but I put the plus there for a definite reason, into those really I think becomes very important. And lastly, the broader attributes, and again there's an increasing emphasis here, and there was a very pivotal moment last year in the UK where EY, Ernst & Young, announced they were no longer going to use the degree classifications of UK universities to determine their employment and recruitment of graduates. And that's a very strong message, because it's simply saying it does not correlate with what we need, and they're looking for particular attributes. The one point I'd make on this is that some of the attribute definition is changing, and let me flick to the, well, before I do that, just to mention for the data science degree, you see an image there on the right-hand side of the screen. This is the single biggest demand for graduates worldwide, the US, Europe, across the world. Instead of academics trying to create the degree, what we did last year, we brought in senior representatives from Accenture, Intel, IBM, SAS, and a number of indigenous Irish companies, and we co-wrote a curriculum, which was a very interesting experience for us, but it really meant that those would be employing the graduates, and they want them immediately. Actually, we were very satisfied from the beginning, and it's within that context we've introduced the living degree, and similarly for biotech degrees and other areas of relevance. But this is an interesting slide here which shows, it's from the World Economic Forum in Davos last year, where a major survey of employers across the world, I think about 5,000 employers, were asked what would be the attributes they would expect for graduates they would employ in 2020. Now, some of the obvious ones are there, like problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, but look as you go down, and even the bottom one, emotional intelligence. And I think it's a fundamental question for universities, how far we go with fostering those. Can we get into those spaces? They're talking about empathy as well, but it's an interesting space, but certainly we've taken the top 5 there and integrated those directly into all our degree programs and making sure that we foster that development. The second thing is in the area of research and innovation and working with businesses. Some of the issues that arise, normally speaking, you're talking about very well-defined goals and a horizon that's short to medium term rather than very long term. It's very rare that a multinational will share its long-term technology roadmap with universities in our part of the world. So it's more problem solving of a short or to medium term basis. One of the advantages is, though, that universities get clear articulation of problem statements. And for us, that's the essence of where innovation starts. Once you get that clear articulation, we can apply our creativity to that. The other thing that's particularly relevant to this conference here is that the university or industry partners really love the short response times of younger institutions, our agility, which is critically important. They say they don't get that with the older institutions. Final point here is around intellectual property. It is absolutely critical in our experience to have very strong professional management of IP, effectively at the level that industries themselves have it. And secondly, in that they're one of the death to any sort of industry partnership is having unrealistic expectations. And many universities have spent many weeks arguing about IP that was never actually realized. So I think that's important. So in terms of benefits for universities, for us, it's about enhanced profile and impact. It's clear evidence of contribution to the innovation ecosystem, adding competitiveness, whether it be to startups, SMEs, or multinationals, and being directly involved in job creation. And I think that's a very strong metric for governments, and it encourages governments to keep investing in universities. Citation impact was very good presentations yesterday afternoon showing that where you collaborate with industry, and particularly international industry, citation impact goes up. But bear in mind, in some cases, in some contracts, publications will not be allowed, or at least will only be on agreement basis. Certainly for students involved in industry academic partnerships, their ability to get employed really goes through the roof because they really become industry ready, and they often move back and forth between the university labs and industry. And finally, in some cases, but it's not that often. Revenue gets enhanced through licensing and so on. Some of the challenges, we have to just recognise that there is a fundamental clash of cultures, a fundamental clash of missions. We have to recognise that from the start. What a university sets out to do, what an industry sets out to do is different. How they do it is different. So there's also a danger of a short-term approach to curricular content and degrees, and if one simply listened to what was being asked by industry all the time, you just have a constant flow over of new material. You can't do that. In some areas as well, there can be constraints on curiosity-driven research. If something is discovered in the course of a research contract, there are milestones and demands from the industry partner, and that can be problematic. And frequently, I don't know if many of you have discovered this, but often because of some of those earlier problems, the emphasis in research groups, including my own over many years, had to move from PhD students to postdocs. The balance changes quite significantly because of the demands, timelines, and so on. And finally, the intellectual property piece. Anyway, final slide. The recipe success from our experience is certainly developing a shared vision from the start and articulating common objectives from the start. It's about expectation management. It's recognizing that there are different cultures, different demands, but actually trying to accommodate these on both sides. It's like any good relationship, it's about compromise and getting that right from the start, agreeing intellectual property principles and publication procedures, and ultimately it's about trust and respect. And again, like any good relationship, regular dialogue always helps. So that's our learning experience itself. But certainly, I don't think universities in this world can avoid growing relationships with industry, but I think it has to be worked out very clearly from the start and productive partnerships established.
Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you, Brian, and we'll obviously come back to questions a bit later, but I think that's given a great introduction to the panel. I'm going to move on now to introduce our second panellist, Greg Stone. Greg is a principal of Arup and leads the digital business of Arup Australasia, focusing particularly on commercial and retail buildings, rail, aviation, highways and utilities, so that covers a lot. At Arup, he's engaged with smart city initiatives locally and throughout the region. He has 25 years' experience in the built environment and global scale technology design. In his present role, he provides design, strategy, insight and operational efficiency for Arup's clients across the built environments. Prior to this, he spent a decade as a CTO at Microsoft Australia, as well as being a founder of the Open Data Institute in Australia, and he's also currently chair of the Industry Doctoral Training Centre Advisory Board for the Australian Technology Network of Universities. So thank you very much, Greg.
Thanks, Debbie. What I thought I'd do, coming from where I do, which is industry, and right now a company that has about 10% of the employees that I had in my previous role. There's 14,000 in Arup, which is a multinational engineering company, but nonetheless we're undergoing a whole lot of changes ourselves, and so are our clients. And I thought that might be a useful lens to start thinking about some of the issues that we're here to really prosecute at the moment. The core logic, I guess, for me is, when I think about this particular problem, is that much of the dialogue we've had so far has really been about how do we do it within the context of what's happening now, or what has happened, i.e. the arguments for how should we structure industry engagement with universities, what should it look like, how should we handle IP, etc. But in reality, organisations, certainly ours and the ones that we deal with, they've really got to prepare for the environment that they will see themselves in the relatively near future, and certainly beyond, not the one that they've been optimised for thus far. And that's one of the great schisms that's occurring in business right now, is that we have a whole generation and a whole almost soup to nuts organisation in most companies that's been optimised for doing things that is currently not what's needed for when they address the future. So that's where I'm kind of coming from, and as I thought a bit about how to demonstrate how fundamentally things have changed, I thought I might give you an example that is very commonplace now that I experience, which is needing to get some takeout. Takeaway meal, my wife and I decided we wanted to have that, the kids weren't around, and I could have gone down as you would normally do if you knew the area pretty well, and you could say, well, we know that's a really great takeaway thie, we'll go there, or we've heard this is a good one. But I didn't. I went on Yelp. And with Yelp, I was able to find out which was the most genuine Thai, which was the best by reputation. I was able to go there, I was able to book it, I was able to pay for it, select the menu, and have a time sent to me indicating when it would be ready to go and pick it up. Now that in itself is pretty commonplace in terms of experience for most of us, but the reality of how that happens is produced by all these different services coming together. So for example, the phone knows where I am, so it can find out within a radius how far these various places are that I'm thinking about. I don't want to go 10 miles. It can also link into kind of reputation. So Yelp actually runs a reputational system. But it's interesting that when I then made the selection to go to a particular restaurant, I actually went off and another service was providing that called Eat Now. And it allowed me to look through the menu, which they'd posted there. And it allowed me to select and then pay for via a payments gateway that was provided by yet another party. And this is what we're seeing out there, is that in order to pay down on this profoundly different experience that people want, we've got to do business differently, and that's requiring the collaboration of a lot of different functional bits that are often provided by different entities. And we in our own business are finding exactly the same. So for us, for example, this changing mix of contributors is really forcing us to look at, well, who should the contributors be? What should the relationship be with them? And how should we develop it, or not develop it, as the case may be? In our own industry, for example, we're seeing a fundamental change in real estate, where we do large buildings. They typically are a 5-year arc from when they consider doing them to when the tenants come in and turn the key. That's a long time. You know, it was just a little over 5 years ago that the iPad kind of came into commercial use, general use, and look how dramatically things have changed. What we find is that as those developers are talking to prospective tenants, the tenants are saying, well, we don't know actually what floor area we want to have, because we don't know how many employees we'll have. We are hearing that 30 to 40% of our current employee base may actually be impacted by artificial intelligence. We may have a lot of machines running things. What we do know is we need high levels of flexibility to cope with the sort of course correcting and change that we know will impact us 2020 and beyond when we come into this building. And so we then are faced as those who help developers create space. We then are faced with this conundrum about how do you do that when you have concrete and steel and stuff that you have to put together, and it needs to be an asset for 20 to 30 years at least. And yet you have this need for enormous flexibility. And so weaving a digital layer into that physical space becomes a very important consideration. And that's where we need to partner with many different types of disciplines, including individual deep knowledge experts, universities, and a conundrum of others, or a collection of others, that we haven't yet identified. And that's the kind of future that I think the university sector in particular faces. And that's the sort of future I think we need to start honing our attention on. The last thing is, what do we need as an entity? I think we need multiple disciplines, as I've said. We need the sorts of T-shaped individuals that you mentioned, Brian. We need research and deeply informed knowledge pools available to us. But we need them available quickly, and we need them to be available for quick, short, sharp reality checks that enable us to course correct. Because many of the decisions we need to make are, this looks very complex. Do we want to go in and dig deeper, or is it simply a wrong direction? And we need to make that decision quickly. So the typical 1 to 3 year research engagements are really problematic for that. And last of all, we need this fast and we need it flexible. So I think, you know, those, at least from my point of view, from the sorts of industry size participant that Arup is, that's the sort of thing that we're desperately seeking, and we desperately need to work together in order to access that, in order to deliver on, you know, these very real needs that are emerging in the economy now.
Thank you very much, Greg, and I think that's given us a fantastic perspective from obviously a large engineering firm, and I'm now going to take us to our last speaker. So we've got a wonderfully diverse panel here today, and introduce Leanne Kemp, who is the founder of Everledger. So a startup, it's been In operation for 2 years, it provides global tracking and protection of diamonds and other valuable items. The startup has won recognition for its real-world application of blockchain database technology. It's only been around for 2 years, but it's already received 9 major awards, including the MEFI Award in 2015 for innovation in fintech, the European Financial Tech Award in 2016 for Best Blockchain Company, and the Asia Insurance Technology Award 2016 for Best Newcomer. With her extensive background in emerging technologies, business, jewellery and insurance, Leanne is working towards creating global transparency and an ethical trade platform. And when I was talking to Leanne downstairs, she described herself as a serial entrepreneur, but I'll let her tell us a bit more about that.
Someone else described me as that.
Over to you, Leanne.
You know, actually, I had walked into the room thinking I knew what I was going to say, and then I've changed what I'm going to say. So my background's 25 years in emerging technology, and I'm a Brisbane girl, and I went to school at Somerville House, and I live only 20 minutes north side from here in Sanford, so it's my home. You know, and I've traversed many things in my career that led me to where we are today, but it always occurred to me, now that I have the vision of hindsight, that I've been touted as a serial entrepreneur, which when I began to kind of deconstruct that, it meant French for nobody would employ me. And if you're fortunate enough to be in London, as I am, and was asked to stay on as the entrepreneur in residence, that also translates to free rent in London. So those two things are the benefits of being an entrepreneur. But you know, and I've had mild successes in Australia in terms of building a business and being a startup. But I've also faced the friction of that, and the friction of you know, the existing regimes that are in place and the assumptions that those regimes will continue forward for the next decade or future generations. But it's fair to say, as entrepreneurs or as a radical thinker, of which some people might couple together, that we start to think differently, we act differently, and we begin to imagine the future possible is able to be constructed today. So we actually, from the very baseline of our thinking, we remove all previous assumptions and all previous bedrock. And we're comfortable in taking that thought process, but even more important, beyond the thought process, we're more comfortable in actually operationalising that thought and materialising. So what's missing? Everything's missing. Not once did I see on a slide, I'm going to be one of those bad panellists that, you know, stir it up. We always see universities reaching out to large incorporates incumbents. We always see that. They want IBM and they want SAP and they want to work with those companies. But we're not there. You know, those companies are fast moving towards the startup world. They're searching for entrepreneurs, and if they can't find entrepreneurs, they're looking for intrapreneurs. Any part of radicalisation they're trying to, because they're grappling, they're trying to work out where this new form of the molecule of the universe is moving towards. So I'd like to embrace that. Let's not make a mistake and get to another decade and come back and say sorry for something. Let's embrace that, that the world's changed, that there is a series of existing paradigms that are in place, that we need to embrace the crazy entrepreneurs and provide a maker space around that, enable a priority around these resources and those types of people. We're no longer that exotic Madagascan turtle that's in the crazy island somewhere. There is entrepreneurship within every single one of us by virtue of the fact that the tooling that we have today has exponential value. We're able to take our thinking and materialise that in such a way quicker than we've ever been able to. And my nieces are 5 years old and they're literally codifying entire work processes for their homework so that they know that they can get more time on their computer in leisure time. So they've got, you know, they've worked everything out. They've thought about it, and they're 5 and they're 6 years old. I mean, it's an incredible thing to see and to watch. You know, I challenge, there is an absolute place in the world for research and development, but more importantly, it's how do we realise the theory around research and development. And startups are in the best opportunity to do that, because we're not bedrocked back by the 100-year plan or the 5-year financial horizon. We are literally fighting for survival. So we will do whatever it takes to enable that solution to become real. We also have to fight for credibility. We have to walk in the door. We have to do the work more than anybody else to be able to at least have the conversation, or someone return my phone call, or even invite me to a LinkedIn request. But if there was a phone call from anyone from IBM or an SAP, then that phone call would automatically be answered, purely because of the corporate brand that's associated with it. So that's the other part. There has to be some mechanism of realisation that this is a changing world. And that we have seen this, in the baby boomers, SMEs. I think Australia is the most prolific country in the world that provides a platform for SMEs to flourish, and they're the biggest contributors of tax in our country. And they are entrepreneurs by their own means. Some of them run franchises, but they add their own personal flair to it. And so we need to see this at an economic level with entrepreneurs, and how do we embrace that and move it forward. The internship model doesn't work anymore. we do get some good skill sets, but we're not really seeing that broadness. And the social thinking and the millennials are very different people to be able to try and coerce or manage or maintain through a bridge from university into the real world. Some students will thrive under the rigidity of corporate onboarding, and others will really flourish when it comes to the chaos theory of startups. And so I think a rethinking of the internship program is paramount. We as startups, we want access to future world thinking that has some scientific baseline and methodology about it. It's super important, because I can reimagine the possible tomorrow, already growing potatoes on Mars, but unless there's some fundamentals that sit below it, I just end up becoming crazy. They would literally medicate me rather than award me an award. So we desperately need that as well. So there you go. I kind of threw a few things out there. That was my...
Thank you very much, Leanne. So I think we've had some wonderful opening comments, and obviously across a wide spectrum. So Leanne, I want to go to you first. You've thrown a few things in there, and when we were downstairs, I asked you the question, are universities delivering you, the graduates, with the skills that you need? And you said to me, no. So could you elaborate on that a bit more, and what skills are missing, and what do you think universities should be doing, and is it about doing it more collaboratively? But over to you, Leanne.
The large slide that you put up around emotional intelligence is, if you were to pie graph the importance of that emotional intelligence, by far is probably, I think, on a ratio average well above what's needed. That's clearly missing, but I think it's missing beyond just university. So there's a big social change going on. The thinking in terms of silos is something that the world has also changed. The single degree view has also fundamentally changed because of the way upon which technology is interacting now between itself and with us as human beings and with us as corporations. We often find that the better students are the ones that have cross-disciplined and have recognised the need to have a cross-discipline, and have had some excitement around the technology and the change that's afforded to them. And it's certainly not, you don't want to become a generalist. You still have to have a specialist, but there's something that's clearly emerging in the use of technology. For example, in my space, in the world that I work in, we have smart contracts and blockchain, and then reg tech that sits over the top of it, yet there's still single degree law degrees, and most of the law firms are still thinking about, let's just bring a typical law student into the organisation, rather than thinking we need a massive computer science division, because we will literally be codifying the way legal contracts are constructed and have deterministic outcomes. So that's the piece that, for me, that's sort of missing. We've typically gone into the space of deep technical computer science, but it's very clear that if we had a cross-faculty set of students and that was afforded to us globally, then that would be a huge uptake from our perspective.
Thanks, Leanne. Brian, if I could go to you to just follow up on that point. You talked about, or gave the example of bringing industry in to sort of co-create curricula with the university. I'm interested in what gaps did industry bring to the table? What were they looking for that you perhaps had not thought of or your colleagues hadn't thought of?
Well, I suppose both parties come from different perspectives, and the industry would say, an academic might say, well, this particular language here, or this particular approach here to databases, and the industry would say, no, that's gone. We really need this, we really need that. So, and we have to avoid the notion of universities being a service, education as a service, research as a service. That's not where universities are to be. So there's a little bit of tension in that, but ultimately there was common agreement around that. Can I come back to some of Leanne's questions? So she bounced a few hand grenades in my direction here. I think I better kick them back.
We'll go to the pub later.
Good. No, but I think they're very important points. You talked about the learning experience of students and the interdisciplinary. I think that's critically important. One of the best lessons we've learned in recent years is starting to have multidisciplinary hackathons for students, where you bring the students from humanities, from the STEM areas together, and it is about problem solving in a compressed space. In fact, I'd go as far to say you cannot teach innovation in a lecture theatre. It has to be through experiential learning, and I think you can really see students growing through these processes. You also mentioned the millennials. The other thing we've learned is fostering a culture of social entrepreneurship, whereby students, many of them are motivated by life with purpose and social impact, but they learn the principles of entrepreneurship through that. In many cases, they're taking technical skills to apply to social problems, and there's a very rich learning experience in there as well. So I think we can address those issues. But I would raise the point again, as I did in my few minutes, emotional intelligence and empathy. I would ask the question, can universities foster development of those? Is that something? Number one, is it our business? And number two, is it possible?
And I guess I would, as an ex-psychologist, and I absolutely agree with you, but a pure psychologist would say you can't teach emotional intelligence.
That's my view.
You can give students the experiences through which they will become more empathic and more understanding of other disciplines. So it's whether that's, and in my world, I kind of think that's what we should be doing. And I think you're right, it's these cross-disciplinary hackathons and things like that. But it's an interesting question, can you teach somebody to be emotionally intelligent? Anyway, we may come back to that in the questions. Greg, if I could come to your point, because you're making some of the same points at a meta level, I think, but around what industry is looking for from universities in terms of research partnerships and collaboration. And I really, what resonated with me was the move away from the 1 to 3 year projects, and that's the space obviously that universities have occupied, the linkage grants, the PhD, joint scholarships and joint projects. Have you got examples of where universities are doing this well, meeting your needs, and what are they doing differently to what they used to do before?
Yeah, I have. I mean, I've experienced both. And one of the problems with the longer cycle research programs is that in an organisation, if you, even a year, you can find someone else has moved to another department who had ownership of that, and certainly by 3 years, they've probably left the firm. And so you have no continuity, you have no knowledge transfer. And the other thing is you have no means by which the value of that collaboration can be distributed through the organisation, and hence seen as value, and therefore wanted to be replicated. So that's a kind of fundamental problem. The second thing is where we found a lot of value is when we've had students, and we've even had undergraduate students and postdocs and docs come in and literally work with us X days a week inside Arup on a particular problem. We've had a couple recently that we've conducted with one of the universities, and we've had students that have come in and they were doing design, architectural design. And we did a whole program with them around sensors, but it was real life stuff. So we were able to get, a structural engineer and someone who was working on a real $100 million project to really go through the nuts and bolts of, well, this won't work here because you've got too much steel and it will attenuate the signal, and all the nitty-gritty that gave them this tremendous insight into the theoretical was great, but the practical looks like this. But how can we now use the theoretical to overcome that? And so some of those iterative, collaborative engagements have been enormously valuable. And valuable for us because we've been able to then identify the one or two students where we go, we want to employ that person. But also valuable for the student because they've gone away with an appreciation that, wow, this is an area that I actually want to go to. I thought in my degree it was this way. I would make the point that we're finding in those that the success lies in the outliers rather than the middle of the bell curve. To your point.
I was going to say, well, they've just gone and said, that's great. I'm just going to go and do my own startup.
Yeah.
Because you guys will be too slow to do it.
So the feedstock has been largely lacking in the kinds of curiosity and empathetic skill that's required to collaborate successfully because the complexity that we're having to deal with these days is always at the boundaries. It's not in the centre. And by definition, you therefore need rich levels of communication to deal with that problem space, as well as your own domain expertise. And so you have to have this amalgam of very good interpersonal skills and very deep specialist skills that you can put on the table together. And that's a hard thing.
Brian, in the Irish context and islands, if we look at OECD comparisons of university business collaboration, obviously Australia is down one end and referred to that in my opening comments. Ireland performs much better. What do you think has allowed that to occur? I mean, our previous chief scientist Ian Chubb used to talk about it takes three to tango. You need universities, you need industry, and you need government to all be on the same page. But can you give us some insights from the Irish context?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think it does take three to tango in this context, but consistent government policy is crucial. And for Ireland, Ireland has come from very bad austerity around 2008, 2010, right to now where we've really bounced back. And it was about making jobs the single metric that was important to the government itself. So if I give you one example, because I sat on this board for research prioritisation strategy for the state, so all of the money going to research, the approach they took, it needed to be the intersection of research excellence, demonstrable research excellence on one hand, but also economic opportunity on the other. And that's how they decided on 10 or 12 major priorities and funded those. And give you a sense of the scale, one of the research centres on our campus is called Insight. It's the largest research centre on data analytics in Europe. It's over 400 researchers, 90 million euro investment in this, half from the government, half from industry. And so this is the leverage for industry. So this is the third stool, the third leg of the stool, very important. And again, working with about 50 different companies. So it was about giving leverage in terms of investment to industry, giving outputs of relevance to industry, embedding foreign direct investment, creating spin-offs, because that's the other part of this, and through Make a Movement and so on. But it was consistent government policy, and they have not, even in the most difficult times, moved away from that. It was interesting, even in the worst of austerity, research funding in Ireland, which could be better, but didn't really drop. So it was that approach that I think that has helped us to bounce back.
I totally agree. I mean, I spent 12 months living in Dublin and immersed myself in the culture there, both from a standpoint of innovation, worked closely with Google and Facebook and IBM in Dublin. And what's interesting in Australia is we have had consistent government policy here, research and development grants being one of them, mostly based on scientific exploration. But they've missed the C, the commercialisation piece. And there is a commercialisation part or a segment of it, but it's not RDC. It's not research, development, commercialisation. It doesn't have a natural evolutionary form, which is the whole point. We want to foster jobs. We want to foster innovation. And I've been so excited. I actually remember coming back about a year ago and met the minister and the premier here and said, why didn't you guys do this like 3 years ago? I would never have left home. Because we didn't have the baseline, we didn't have the right government backing or the thinking. And now, of course, we have, a state-appointed entrepreneur, we have innovation programs, we have the startup scenes, we're starting to have maker spaces, we have these sorts of forums where this is an IBM here, right? This is a scrappy startup, so that's great. We're starting to think about this formation of new thinking, and it is starting to penetrate. It's pretty exciting.
No, thanks, Leanne. Greg, if we could come back to some of your comments you made about what industry is going to need into the future. What do you see as the biggest challenge in terms of what you're looking for in the future and how you're going to source the expertise from wherever? And I take your point, it's going to be multiple partners. What's the biggest challenge that you see?
The biggest challenge is finding the right resource fast enough on terms that are flexible enough. That's pretty much what it comes down to. The landscape is changing so rapidly that there are a number of different things that we need help with at any one time, and it's growing. The challenge for us is balancing how do we actually create and maintain our own networks so we know who's who in the zoo, what's happening, who do we go to. That takes time, with actually doing what we do. And that balance, we're constantly recalibrating that the whole time. And it's getting more and more difficult to do. So for example, in our own particular area, we're refactoring Arup internally so that we're essentially applying much of the kind of technologies that the large tech companies use in cloud and artificial intelligence, etc., to start building a very componentized approach to the way we do engineering and exposing that externally to create new business models for how Arup provides engineering advice. You know, the big consultancies are doing the same with accounting already. That relies on us understanding a whole lot of things around where technology is going and how we should therefore build, what standards we should use, who are the best at things that we should actually buy as a bespoke proprietary thing in the interim, how we should abstract it, all those sorts of decisions. They're things that we need help with. But for many of these areas, because they're so new, we need to constantly be either exploring or building up our networks in that area, or in some cases being referred by others. But it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to manage that broad canvas. So that is the hardest thing. And yet when you look at a university, it actually is this melting pot of broad ideas that actually, in many cases, know stuff that we don't know. So that's kind of the biggest conundrum we face.
Yeah. No, that's good. Thanks, Greg. I might open it up now to see if there's, because I'm sure there's questions from the floor from our audience. We've got microphones. Yes, Tanya. Seeing as I've been
Thanks for the really diverse, interesting discussion. Brianne, you commented on co-location and the number of companies that have located near your university. I was a bit surprised not to hear a little more in this panel about mobility, because one thing that strikes me is in Australia we have very poor mechanisms for people coming into unis from industry and vice versa. And I wanted to know if there are any lessons we could learn from Ireland on mobility and what you might do differently.
Thanks, Tanya. Certainly our experiences with creating fora for regular engagement and the proximity of that technology park or innovation campus, as we call it, has been hugely advantageous, because the staff in those various companies, and there's maker space in there and there are a lot of Internet of Things companies, they move it in and out of the campus itself, the main academic and research campus. We have created possibilities for mobility of staff in both directions, but there's been very little take-up. And I think if there's regular engagement and if there's a large degree of permeability through proximity and a culture of permeability back and forth, I think you get the same effect. But I can't give you advice on the mobility back and forth, because really very little of it has happened. But also by the very fact of some of our industry academic large-scale contracts with multinationals, they place their researchers directly in our labs themselves. So, and again, you have to get management of those processes right, but when it works extremely well. And a lot of our partnerships with companies like Intel, IBM, Becton Dickinson, and the life sciences space, they've lasted over a decade and more. So when it works well, it works very well.
How about, Brian, the mobility for students?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that proximity of our innovation campus worked well for students as well, and then through our internships, and we started introducing internships and what we're calling industry PhDs as well. So students themselves are moving back and forth between industry labs, and again you can see the students, whether they be undergraduate or postgraduate, developing and transforming in front of you. And I think that sort of mixed cultural experience particularly, as you were saying earlier, Greg, about being exposed to the real world problems and how industry operates, hugely transformative.
And whether, you know, if we instill that culture among our students, they will then become much more mobile in terms of being staff on either side, whether it be industry or the universities. Now, there's a question up the back there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Maria Clave. I'm the president of Harvey Mudd College, which is a small science and engineering school outside of Los Angeles. And Harvey Mudd has been doing something for almost 50 years that I didn't hear any of you talk about, which is we happen to call it a clinic project. It's a weird name, but the basic idea, so Harvey Mudd was started, Olin College is modeled very close on Harvey Mudd. Brianne knows all about Harvey Mudd, so, but one of the things we started 50 years ago was this idea that you really want your students to work on real world problems, and you want them to be highly, and we actually have a Harvey Mudd grad here who's a faculty member at QUT, Travis Klein, whom I just met today. And the whole idea was that you want a student-led team that will work on a project that actually really matters to a company. Today, companies pay just under $50,000 to do this. They get all the IP, they get all the, whatever gets built, the prototypes, the documentation, the software, whatever it is. And we do about, we're a tiny place, we have about 800 students, but we do 40 to 45 of these industry-funded projects per year. And I'm just wondering if, you know, there are a number, this has been copied in a number of places in the US, but I'm not sure whether it's been copied in Australia or other places. And I will say that for companies, they think it's one of the best deals they can possibly get because they get to work very closely with a team of 4 to 6 students, seniors, so a lot of them get hired. But also, it's cheap compared to the cost of actually funding a graduate student or a postdoc or anything else. So I'm very curious to see whether there are other institutions who are doing things like that.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to?
Yeah, thanks Maria. I mean, it's a brilliant idea, and I know it works very well. The nearest we have to that is twofold. One is finally our projects. They can either be individual or group projects. And what we find is students who are out in internships in their third year for 6 or 8 months often bring a project back with them and then maintain that engagement with industry for the project. So it's better in a group, I think, for the reasons we heard earlier on. The second model we use that works extremely well, but it's sometimes hard to get industries to agree to this, but when we run hackathons, we bring in particular companies and ask them to talk or to articulate a set of problem statements. So then the hack is really about solving those, combining software and hardware over a weekend period, for example. Again, a huge learning experience, and then again, it's win-win, as you say. The students develop huge appreciation of what real innovation processes are like, and the companies often get a prototype solution very quickly. So, but I think the clinic, and is that what Rick is doing at Olin College as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that the first vegan practical products position at Olin is somebody who takes
Leanne?
Yeah, I might answer both those questions. So the mobility question, and then so what's interesting we're 30 staff, we're in 4 countries, and we're only 2 years old. And we've also preserved significant value in terms of the ownership. So we've not gone out and raised considerable amount of money. And what's interesting about the journey is that we've been able to, first, we started thinking as a global company day one, and we understood that distributed workforce was hugely important. We've won a lot of awards on the back end of being a blockchain startup, and I have to continue to say, I'm so sorry, but we're not a blockchain startup. We take the very best of emerging technologies. So, you know, we're using blockchain, smart contracts, machine vision, cognitive. How do we bring all of those complementary technologies together and create this sort of symphony of excellence and apply it into a marketplace? Now, as a part of that regime, for us to be able to do this, there is actually not a lot of diamonds traded in London. In fact, there's none. But yet our head office is in London. We have relied partnerships with Barclays Bank, and they've done a fantastic job of understanding the accelerator process and how you can partner with startups and provide an environment for that startup to interface with the corporation, and Barclays Bank being one of those corporate places. They also created a makerspace called Eagle Labs, which just goes a step further and starts thinking beyond the data layer, actually starts thinking about physical devices and hardboard engineering places. Now you literally become a Barclays baby. You become an alumni of that ecosystem. And the same thing, of course, happens in the startup space with the tier 1 accelerators like Y Combinator or Techstars. So we are hugely mobile, and we're able to transfer the commercial value that we've created in London or in Australia and transfer that at a safety net into New York. And we literally, that entrepreneur in residence idea, rent-free in London, is beyond that though, because we're literally walking into a complete makerspace with access to the corporates, with access then back into the other startup worlds. And what's missing is how do we get the localised expertise or the disciplinary approach that universities bring to this. So there's real world examples, which is why the scrappy startups, we actually don't need a lot. We need a great internet connection, good coffee, which is why you'll find a heap of startups started in Starbucks. Yeah. I mean, I went, that was my office for the first year. Every Starbucks, that's all I went to. Or if I was really bad and I was hungry, it was McDonald's. Because there was always a free internet connection. That's all we needed to start to ingest our ideas. So that's the mobility space. Imperial College in London is doing some similar programs to what the lady at the back mentioned, and we've worked and embraced Imperial College in London as a part of that process with Imperial College. Mm.
Greg, how does it resonate with you in terms of the sort of internship group project kind of clinic model?
Well, I can really attest to this notion that having kind of like a worker space, some shared space is becoming more and more important. Yeah. Let me go back to some of the premises that have often been adopted in here around what we need, which is hey, we need to work with the Googles or the Microsofts or the Amazons or whomever, and we find the same. We want to work with such and such a large multinational. The reality is those multinationals are doing business here. The development is done generally centrally. Yep. And so your ability to engage with them is relatively shallow. Where you have some multinationals, IBM does it, Google a little bit, certainly Microsoft does it, and SAP does it. They will actually work, as Arun will know, with universities and take particular researchers down in their programs, and you have researcher to researcher. But that is a parallel university course than the mainstay of the business that you want to work with. So I think that is something we need to look beyond, and we need to think about, rather than creating these precincts that have a large multinational sat in the middle of them and hoping that somehow we'll get knowledge transfer. You won't. You get a curtain wall, and you get a black box when they go in, and they generally will suck your talent up if they can, because they pay well.
Whereas all we want is a cup of coffee.
Well, they just want a cup of coffee. So if the work we do, interestingly, the work that's being done in my group, we've got a group that focuses on smart precincts and smart cities. So we've done and London also has pioneered a whole lot of research around, well, what constitutes a really great development? What are the things that are needed? And increasingly, there are these transition spaces, shared spaces. And we're now seeing, as I alluded to before, that is the flexible element that large corporate buildings are now looking to be one of the mechanisms that they also will use in order to facilitate the kinds of innovation they desire. So I think there's a germ of something that absolutely needs to be investigated.
One thing that we did quite well was we created, because we're little, so we could potentially be quite a disruptive force, but we don't often say that publicly. So we co-evolve the thinking. But one thing we did quite well we have global partnerships that are penned in ink with IBM, SAP, MasterCard. These are big name companies, Google and Google X. What we did quite well through that makerspace, through that mobility, through the scrappy startups that just wants coffee, we created a safe contractual space. That we could understand that safe contractual space for us. That gave us the freedom and the ability to actually share with an end intent that was not shrouded by, I've got a really big brother that's like the head of the rugby team, that if I push him too far, he's going to squash me. So I'm too scared to to go that sort of extra step, or I'm too scared to really bring the maverick out and actually give them the real world thinking where it can be. So that's another part. It's not just about the place and coffee, it's understanding that safe contractual space, particularly for us in startups. Because universities for us, you're the Sherpa for us. Okay, so we're happy to go and do the crazy mountain ride to the summit of Everest on one oxygen bottle, but we have to check back in to understand the pathway that we're actually taking. The corporates, that's okay, they either just chop it to the top and say giddy up, let's go, or they actually just start building roads and they're going to take 3 years to get there, but it's going to be a smoother ride. You know, we have to go up and down on these goat tracks, but we have to check in at every single point in time, either to give cross-validation for the craziness that we're doing, which we're in the process of making sure that, you know, the baseline of what we've just experimented and delivered is true and correct, or are we tactically too far left and we're going to end up falling off the earth that was actually flat and not round. So, yeah.
Thanks, Leanne. Other questions? Renee? No, there's probably, here we are.
Hi, I'm Renee Hindmarsh from the Australian Technology Network of Universities, and thank you to all of the panellists. I was really struck, Leanne, by what you were saying about small and medium enterprises being the economic driver in Australia, and one of the stats that always resonates with me is the fact that we have 97% of our businesses here in Australia are small and micro businesses. And you were talking about place and coffee and a safe contractual space, but is there anything else that universities can do to address the capacity issue that these small and micro businesses have when it comes to getting to that next level, and how we can potentially help them on that journey? And is it about what Greg said in terms of knowing who's who in the zoo, or is it something else?
It's access to access to education. It's access to being able to dig into the research and know how that can be applied within their discipline, in their industry. That sometimes when you face a university and you've become a mum and dad who's built a business is a super scary proposition, because whilst we have, you know, a large percentage of our SMEs, if you really dig into the demographic of those SMEs, university is a super scary place to be because they probably didn't go. And so they wouldn't naturally think, being an SME, to dig back into universities because that was preserved for the once brilliant academics. So I think it's bridging that real world. What can we do to help with the real world? And we talk about, you know, education for the real world or the students of the real world, but we're not really taking that message into SMEs. So it's kind of scary for them because you're all really smart, you know, and there's lots of letters after your name. Also access to data and technology, just in a place where they can start to flourish. And startups have been built on that. So we've seen quite an impressive startup company come into accounting software space, which is Xero, and they embrace every mum's and dad's business, whether it's a dog washing company or whether it's a multinational that are using it for accounting software. But they're starting to afford easier tools for those mums and dads to not be embarrassed or to have affordability to access to that, the tooling and the data. Brian?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that as well. We've tried very hard on this. It is difficult, and it's difficult in both directions because SMEs are generally, again, working to very short timelines, and they're focusing the end of the month and so on. Often they're not thinking of research and innovation. So it is difficult to create that forum. And I spoke to one of the senior officials in the Obama government. They came to Ireland and they were looking at this model. The US is the same. They have not got it right yet. One of the things that we think is starting to work is if you can get bright young graduates and place them inside SMEs and make it really financially convenient for them, you can create that kind of space and thinking and a conduit back into the university situation without the kind of cultural mismatch that you were talking about. And that's starting to show that it might work, but it is a real challenge. And it's the same across the world. SMEs and family businesses are really the bedrock of economies and societies, and they need that kind of innovation lift by direct access to what's happening in universities. But I say I'm not aware of any really strong model that has worked so far.
And and there are segments of the economy that will literally just disappear by virtue of technology. But the SMEs, they're looking at the shells. They haven't realised the tsunami and the wave's gone out, right? They're just looking at what they need to do on a day-to-day basis. And to give them the affordability of what's coming. You don't want to scare them, but to recalibrate what was known as the normal.
It's lifting the head up. It's the focus on the immediate. That's the problem.
Arup?
Yeah, thank you for this diverse discussion. I just want to pick up on the subject of entrepreneurship. And Leanne did mention that if Queensland government had started some programs a few years earlier, she would still be here. We always talk about threats to universities from different, like, whether it is MOOCs or it is technology or new players coming in with different business models. Already the postgraduate coursework market is being taken up by private providers, professional associations, and that is disappearing. There is another threat, and it's not as evident, but if you look at entrepreneurship and entrepreneurship education, this is the threat where universities haven't handled it extremely well. We had the MIT Global Bootcamp here, and earlier this week, we had Leanne was part of a workshop on entrepreneurship, the new graduate destination. And even MIT has done a poor job of it. It just happened. They didn't do anything, and now they're trying to come up with a coordinated, more disciplined approach to entrepreneurship. You start seeing people like Peter Thiel in the US becoming very anti-university. They're prepared to give you $100,000 fellowships if you don't go to university. And there is a sense appearing in Silicon Valley that universities don't matter. It's probably not true, but more and more people are happening. So let me just tell you the story here. We got Josh Lerner from Harvard Business School to do a study of the Queensland innovation system. And he came up with the simple fact, he has not seen a region of the world that has done more more research than development. So the least amount of development. And so the Advanced Queensland program was based to do that. And of course, as universities, we wanted more research. But there was the Peter Thiel of Australia, a guy called Baxter, who basically said, this research is all useless. We have to focus more on entrepreneurship and these programs. So many of these programs that were established as part of the Advanced Queensland didn't happen because the universities wanted. We have become so self-serving around just more research, and often it is more medical research, has no sense of how it is going to create jobs, how it is going to create innovation. And I think we all collectively have to take stock and see that entrepreneurs are creating more jobs. We have to be serious about helping there. Otherwise, our social license to do some of these things is going to be questioned.
No, I absolutely agree with you, Arun, and I think it really goes to the core of some of the issues we've been talking about today. It's not just how we do research and how we engage with industry, it's also how we teach our students and the kinds of experiences we give our students and what we are prioritising. It is deep knowledge as well as breadth, and I think getting that right, because, as we all know, without that deep knowledge, we won't have impact, but our graduates have to know that it has to be surrounded by the breadth of skills and the empathy and the way to work collaboratively across disciplinary boundaries to be able to contribute in the way that we've discussed today. But they are, I agree with you, Arun. In many ways universities have been self-serving and have been too narrowly focused, and it's why discussions like this are so important. I'm going to ask Brianne the last question.
Thanks.
Why are young universities good in this space? What is it about the kinds of universities that are represented here today that makes us, I think, there's good examples of us as perhaps doing these things better than some of our older counterparts. What do you think it is?
I'm not sure exactly, but you heard from Martin Paul earlier on, and when we established Yarrow, we looked at what were the common traits of all the universities across there, and it was this kind of engagement with society, engagement with the economy, a very strong focus on our own relevance, a very strong focus on employability and the quality of our graduates. So I think it's partly this connectivity into the ecosystem around us, whether that be society or the economy, and recognising that we want to make an impact, we want to be relevant. It's almost like a self-justification, but it's also this notion of seeing ourselves as having kind of an ethical responsibility to the world around us. I think it's also our agility. And I think we see that across the young universities are very agile, can react to trends, can look at trends, can do horizon scanning, and then position themselves quickly to adapt to that. And I think that's why young universities in this particular summit is very good at picking up on those areas where we can focus and be seen. Phil Beatty has said it many times, that these emerging universities can be the one that ultimately may have the greatest impact if we continue this momentum.
Thanks, Brian. Any closing comments from you, Greg?
Yeah, I kind of echo Brian's comments in the sense that, we find that there's an openness and flexibility with the younger universities that we deal with, that's for sure. And we've dealt with many, because I dealt with older ones and younger ones in my previous role. I'm dealing almost entirely with younger ones now.
Good.
Well, that's just, it's an observation, not a deliberate selection, just as I think about it.
And Leanne will tell us that there's still more that we need to do. So Leanne, final comments from you.
What I will say is that the younger universities have developed an emotional intelligence rather than the students. So, because they haven't done it for startups, so we're going to change that. I'll give you a hand. But the communication around that emotional intelligence, I think, is the piece. The SME market, there's a recognition, but how, and the startup scene and entrepreneurs is another one. So I think that is what has happened. They have developed an emotional intelligence.
I can see Phil writing that down for next year's advert.
So please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. It's been a great discussion.